Good. All right. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. We've got 9:30. That's the time to begin. Hope y'all are doing well. Thanks so much for being here, and thanks as always to St. Luke's for letting me be part of this speaker series. In kicking around what to talk about, I felt it was probably a good idea to stay within my field. Stay in your lane, the idea. So my academic training is in the field of communication. And so what I'm sharing with you is some added, sort of an added augmented version of some stuff that I have taught prior in a capstone class at the university. The first two parts. The third part is going to be completely new, just for you guys. So, but I have added quite a bit of stuff from what I had before. So let's go ahead and get started. And the way I'd like to begin is by putting us all in a time machine. Okay, so we're here, and we are part of this technological revolution where we have access to computers, to iPads, to notebooks. We call a notebook now isn't anything that you write in, right? It's an electronic device. And we have our smartphones that are in some ways smarter than we are. And, all of these things are connected. We're messaging, we are taking phone calls, we are texting, we are writing emails. I have something like 3 email accounts, so I get emails from all of these. So, in the course of the day, flooded with all of these emails. So, we do a lot of our communicating today through a medium of some kind. All right, and so let's just take it back a little bit. I came to Cleveland, Tennessee in 1995, and that wasn't in many ways that long ago. But when I came and got my job at Lee University here in town, I had to bring my own computer because we didn't have. It was not a regular thing for everybody to have a computer at work. We used these clunky devices on our desk that were telephones, and we had advanced to the point where we just pushed the buttons, we didn't do the so yeah, technology. And everything that, was sort of official was done via memo that you typed up, got printed, stuck in an envelope, stuck in an interoffice envelope, and sent on. And so that's kind of the way you had communication between us. It sounds so ancient, doesn't it? And it was just a few decades ago. But then for all other business, we actually did this very rare and increasingly rare thing where we had conversations. And this also seems kind of ancient, where we actually talked to people. We were just talking about this amongst faculty, a group of faculty the other day, is that, once upon a time, we didn't rely so much on messaging and things like that. We actually went to each other's offices and sat down for a little while and had conversations. Well, let's take it back even further. This is before the age of the telegraph, before the age of the radio and all of these types of things. We're going back all the way to the time of Christ. And what you have in that time is none of these technological devices. Okay? You don't even have, there's some kind of semaphore type of technology that's setting, hey, there's a fire up on the hillside, so we know, the enemies are approaching or something like that. They had that level of long distance communication. They had writing, but there was a problem with writing. Only 2% of the population could read. Okay, so you could write a letter, to somebody else. A lot of the wealthier people in the time of Christ had scribes. They themselves, they didn't write their own letters. They had somebody who wrote legibly so that it could actually be read by somebody somewhere else. And then some people had to have their letter read to them by someone who could read. Okay? So all other communication was literally face-to-face. And this is a very different kind of culture when all you can do is, in terms of having word and message conveyed, is face-to-face. So you had runners and couriers and things like that, but a lot of times they would come to whoever it was that was sending them. They would tell them what needed to be conveyed, and they would have to remember it, and then go and share that. So, very different world. And so we've got to understand that that's the world that we're talking about. So we are so used to mass media today. You've probably watched televangelists on television. And when I was a kid, it was a big deal whenever Billy Graham was having a crusade. Okay, so it would be televised as well. So we would watch that. So you'd see this stadium full of people, and a message being preached to a stadium full of people. Even that wasn't there in the time of Christ. Yes, they had stadiums, but those were for sports. So they had, they were as huge, in fact, maybe even huger sports fans in those days than we are today. Chariot racing was huge. Okay? It was the NASCAR at the time. So, and it was the richest athletes in the world at that time were chariot racers. So, you didn't have major public pronouncements given in these types of, because they didn't have sound systems, all right? So even preaching didn't take place in the way that we think of it. Because we have, the setup here in this building, but there weren't necessarily even those kinds of structures in the time that we're talking about. So we sort of have a mindset regarding the idea of preaching that you have a person standing up in front of a large group of people. Well, we've got to kind of flush our minds of all of these types of images, because none of those are there. Okay? And so when we think of Christ, a lot of times we impose our kind of cultural images on the way Jesus did things. So basically what we're doing this 3-part series is talk about how Jesus really did it. Because he didn't do it in any of those ways in terms of communicating the truth and the message. So we begin with this idea of dialogue. And I like the idea of the Christ of conversations. Okay? So Christ's primary means of conveying truth was through conversations with relatively small groups of people. So I like to begin with this idea that Christ as the Word made flesh. And we have, in the Gospel of John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? And we come down to John 1:14. The Word became flesh and had his dwelling among us. Now the word there is a little tricky. The Greek word there is logos. Okay? And logos did, in fact, mean word, like a word, a logos. But in this time period, it meant a lot more than that. Okay? It also meant a sort of unique expression of the divine. Okay? God utters something, and it's word. So wait a minute. Jesus has a physical body. How is physical body word? Strange idea, right? Here's this person. How are you? How are you? How am I a word? Okay, we have to go back to Genesis 1. Because what does it say of creation? God spoke things into existence. He said something, and bam, it was there. Okay, so in a sense, this comes from an understanding or a concept that all of reality is God uttered in some way. God spoke it. So Christ is this word that is inserted into this already spoken creation He is God himself in this spoken creation. So, you have heard, that Jesus came and he, shared the gospel of the good news, is what the gospel means. But then his ministry was accompanied by signs and wonders. Okay, and we hear this word signs. So when you think of sign, what do you think of? You think of, there's a stop sign. All right. Well, that is a sign that's sitting there that's telling us stop, or there will be consequences. Okay. But there are other signs that have words. There are some signs that don't have words on them, right? So, you come to an intersection, there is an indicator there. It doesn't have words on it, but we know when to stop, when to go, when to yield, all these type of things. So, Jesus did things, miracles, but they are, and then later his disciples did things and miracles, and they are referred to as, not always just as miracles, they were referred to as signs, which meant that they carried meaning. So it wasn't just the act. It wasn't just, we had the sermon this morning about the 10 lepers, and Jesus healing them of their leprosy, and that's a sign. What is this? What is it a sign of? A sign of the power of God, but also of God's abiding interest in what's happening in our lives. Okay, a sign not just of the power of God, but of the presence of God, right? So, we talk about some things called signs of the times. This was something I grew up as a kid, in the early 70s. Jesus was coming back at any second. The rapture was just right around the corner, and had one of those rapture experiences where everybody disappeared for a minute, and I thought for sure that I had enough time, so, these were, but, everything that was happening, every war, every earthquake, every hurricane, all of these were referred to as signs of the times. They were all indicators that the world was about to end. But Jesus came, and so much of what he did was about this notion of restoration. And so, in the story today, the last thing Jesus says to the Samaritan who comes and expresses his gratitude and praises God, he says, "Your faith has made you," and the Greek word actually means whole. "Your faith has made you whole. You have been restored. Go your way." In other words, go live your life. You have been made whole. Go live your life. He's not been restored not just physically. His life has been given back to him. Go your way. Go live your life. Go be a normal person now, because he had been an outcast. Nobody wanted anything to do with him. So, when you look then at so many of the healings of Christ, they are that quality. They are not just about healing an illness. They are about restoring a person back to their family or back to their community as well. So, redemption, all of these. So these are all things, the cross, the burial, the resurrection, all of these things bear meaning beyond just the individual things. And what they are part of is this aspect and this dimension of Christ and his coming, which is the unspoken word. Could probably do a whole other series on the unspoken truth, the truths that are embodied. They are through action, not necessarily spoken word. They are acts. We have the Acts of the Apostles, right? So we'll blend all this together. When it comes to the spoken word, there are 3 types of truth sharing from this time period. Okay? One is the one that we're often most familiar with and that we think of when we think of truth sharing. So, someone's going to give us the truth. What are they going to do? They're going to proclaim it. All right? So we kind of get an image of the prophet, coming to a rebellious people and proclaiming God's truth and nobody listening to it, right? So, but proclamation of the truth in a larger setting, sort of basically just almost like a trumpet, a herald, coming in, here's Hero Israel, that's proclamation. The Greek word kerygma refers to proclamation, okay? And I would venture to say that we probably culturally drifted in the direction of that's the most important way to share truth. All right. Would you agree? Yeah. Like, truth has to be proclaimed. Somebody has got to get up there and say it. So we have, the structures and the way church is done, right? Is you got somebody who proclaims the truth in some way every Sunday, several times a Sunday, and on Wednesdays. And, so you've got, the tradition now is very much weighted toward this public proclamation in some way. Second was didache, which is teaching. That's what we're doing here. Okay? Didache is another way of sharing the truth, and that's just sort of building blocks of context and meaning and sharing truth in that way. It's less proclamatory. It's less, thus saith the Lord, and more, let's think about this, let's think about that, let's give you some history. Didache. And then, probably the least popular today from the standpoint of, this is the way you share truth, is dialogue. And the interesting thing is that it was probably reversed in Christ's time in terms of the way truth was conveyed. Probably proclamation was the least employed. Didache was probably right there in the middle. And then dialogue was the first and heaviest, most often used way of sharing truth. And so dialogue comes from the Greek for logos with a prefix, dia, which meant two. Two words, two people talking. And the Hebrew word at the same time, period, is exactly the same word. Two people talking. So dialogue, a monologue is how many people talking? One. Okay. So, you got monologue, then you got dialogue. Dialogue is conversation. And when you stop and think about this, and you go back and you read the actual practice of Jesus, what you find is that Jesus spends the vast majority of his time not out with the multitudes. Okay? He's with the 12. And the 12 were actually this was not something new. You discover that Jesus did a lot of things that were conventional in the time period. So a group of about 12 people that kind of followed and worked directly with a teacher of some kind. This was pretty normal throughout the Mediterranean. It's not just even a Hebrew concept, a Jewish concept. It was throughout the Mediterranean world. And so you have a person who was kind of a mentor teacher. So if you go back and you think about the ancient Greek philosophers who predate Christ by a few hundred years, you have the same model. Okay, you may or may not have heard of the dialogues of Socrates. Same kind of convention where you have one guy, one teacher, who has a relatively small group of people around them, and then they will from time to time teach to a slightly larger group of people, but most often they're just hanging with a small group of people. So that was the 12. And that's the people with whom Jesus spent a lot of his time. But even within the group of 12, you've got a group of 3 that he spends a little more time with. And this is recognized in the Gospels that these, Peter, James, and John, were a little closer in terms of sort of the time that Jesus spent with folks. We don't get a lot of those types of interactions and the content of a lot of those interactions, but we know that they are there. And then there's an often often forgotten aspect of the women who were part of the group. They weren't part of the 12 officially, but they're always around. Okay? So you have Martha, Mary, there's another Mary, and probably a couple other ladies. The indication that some people have is that Mary Magdalene actually was one of the primary financiers of the ministry of Christ. That she was a woman of means, and that she made her means available to Jesus and his disciples. This also was not an unusual type of arrangement, where you had someone who was kind of an itinerant teacher in those days, was very often funded by some of the folks in the community. Okay, so this is, again, Jesus is kind of following this same kind of model. But these women are there, and they are part of these conversations, and they very frequently will show up at key moments. So it's important to realize that even in a culture, the Hebrew culture, the Jewish culture, and it wasn't just them, it was also the Greco-Roman culture, was very, very intent on keeping women separate. Okay, women were not supposed to be part of what was going on. Anything important. So even in the Jewish synagogue of the day, women and children stood behind a screen where they could hear but could not be seen. Okay, and the inner congregation would be, so if we did it the way they did it, it would be only men right here. Then we'd have some screens set up and all the women would be out there. Okay, so we've improved, right, in that regard. But Jesus kind of set the example by starting to take down those sociocultural barriers even during his ministry and allowing them access. We have the wonderful story that is a subject of a sermon every year of Jesus in Martha and Mary's house, and where's Mary? She's at the feet of Jesus. So one of the things that doesn't really get preached on in that sermon, Martha's the one that gets all the abuse in that sermon, right? And because she's kind of upset that Mary isn't helping. Probably what Martha is really upset about in that, given the culture of the time, is that she's where she doesn't belong. Okay? So we have sort of this, upper touch. She should be helping me in the kitchen. But what if part of what she's saying is, she should not be with the men. She needs to be with me in the kitchen. All right. Possibility there. Anyway, but we see that Jesus includes women in the conversations, and to the extent that they very obviously feel comfortable enough to address him directly. Frequently. Okay? So there's some of the evidence that we have there. All right, so when we, again, talk about dialogue and its importance, we go back into the Greco-Roman world and how prevalent it was at that time. So I mentioned a little bit about Socrates, you've got Plato, you've got Aristotle, all of these figures that are kind of doing the same thing, and it moves into the Roman time period as well. Oops, sorry. And so you have an interesting quote from Plato about the importance of dialogue and what is going on in dialogue. I really like this quote from him, that dialogue is brought to birth suddenly in the soul, a light that is kindled by a leaping spark that nourishes itself. The written word is bandied about equally by those who understand and those who have no interest in it. It knows not to whom to speak or not to speak. So Plato is kind of down on the written word. Because he said, it's not really, you really don't know what is happening with it. It's out there, and the people are interested in it, they're engaging in it, but there are people that are doing stuff with it that they probably shouldn't. Because it's written, it's there, it's on the page, it's for anybody to do anything with. Very different when you're talking to somebody face to face. And I think the proof of what Plato was saying here is the very different quality of communication when you're talking to people face to face and when you're talking to them online. Okay? You probably discovered, if you spent much time online, that people online are just mean and short and abrupt. They won't do that generally when they're talking to you face to face. And it's just a quality of things. I've personally made it a habit when I've gotten a curt response on email, I don't respond on email. I go talk to that person face to face. Guess what happens? Whatever spirit or tone was in the email evaporates. It's gone. Because they can't sustain it when you're right there in front of them. And so this I think is an interesting illustration of what Plato is talking about here. There's a distancing that happens when it's a written thing. Okay. Hey, Zoom is great, but even Zoom has its limitations, right? So, in terms of talking to people, it's better, I think, qualitatively than just the exchange of written messages. But part of the problem also with written messages is that we don't actually know. There's so much of the content of what is the nonverbal part of our communication. You don't get any of that in a written message, do you? Okay? So stop and think then that the higher quality of the dialogue is that you're getting the whole person. You're not getting just a fragment of them that you get in written communication. So that's part of what Plato is talking about and why dialogue was such an important aspect in the Greek traditions. It should come as no surprise then that the rabbinical traditions equally value the importance of conversation. And so we have this wonderful quote. It's actually from the head rabbi in the UK, Jonathan Sacks. Jewish tradition teaches that dialogue is a sacred activity. It's kind of funny because we were watching a movie last night that actually talked about dialogue as a holy moment. Okay, when two people are actually able to truly connect in dialogue, it's a holy moment. The Talmud says conversation is a form of prayer, which is fascinating when you stop and think about it. That's a startling and powerful idea. A genuine encounter with a human other can be a prelude to an encounter with the divine other. Oh, this is so true. That many times, some conversations can actually lead us to a different kind and quality of encounter with God. The disciplines required are the same: to be open, to listen, as well as to speak, to be capable of empathy and humility, to honor the other by an act of focused attention. What that obviously means is that for our dialogue to be done right, means that listening has to happen, right? Probably all of us have been frustrated by talking to somebody who you can tell is not listening to you. They're waiting until you stop speaking so they can say what they've been thinking. All right? So they're kind of loading their gun while you're talking. As soon as you stop talking. All right? That's not really dialogue. That's not what we're talking about here. A genuine dialogue listens and responds to the other person as a genuine other. So this speaks then to the social effects of dialogue, which is this aspect of giving the other person worth enough to listen to them. Now, we're all very busy, right? And we have lots going on in our heads. And so sometimes it's difficult to kind of shut down what is going on in our heads long enough to listen to another person. I confess I'm one of those that probably sins in this regard as much or more than anybody else. But stopping and actually listening and giving someone that time gives them a place of honor. Actually elevates them to the same level that we would afford ourselves, right? And so just a pause then to stop and think. And I'm not an anti-technology person, okay, so I should preface this by saying I'm not at all against these communication technologies. But it is somewhat sad, isn't it, that all of these technologies begin to compress and compress and compress the amount of quality interaction that we can actually have. So what that probably suggests is that when we have it, we should let it be as effective as it should be. So the disciples, we've gotten so used to this word disciples, it's kind of become a word that has a certain meaning in our mind. And it's a little bit unfortunate because because the Greek word here is mathetes. Mathetes. You see there's the first four letters there. Math. Okay. Math for us is, numbers. All right. The discipline of math actually comes from the Greek concept of learning. So people who are learners are mathers. Okay. So the Greek word disciple is actually learner, mather. So they're not, the idea of disciple is almost sort of a level of devotion, devotees, that maybe skews a little bit the idea of what is functionally happening in this relationship. And that is that they are learning from Christ. And so the learning takes place in these conversations and in watching them as well. So all of this begins to influence the way we see the gospel. One more quote here from a Russian philosopher, scholar, who talks a lot about dialogue. And so he says, life by its very nature is dialogic, meaning that to live life we have to be in dialogue a lot. To live means to participate in dialogue, to ask questions, to heed, to listen, to respond, to agree, etc. Dialogue is, therefore, inherently responsive. A word, and I love this idea, a word becomes truly alive when it encounters other words. So it's in the mix that language and meaning emerges. It creates something that never existed before, something absolutely new. You didn't know that your conversations were so wonderful, did you? so creative, so meaningful. But this is what's happening in conversation. New meaning is actually being created. This is just a sort of a spine-tingling thought. It creates something that never existed before, something absolutely new. Dialogue is therefore unfinalizable, meaning our conversations don't stop. And so I may have a conversation with you, and then I go have a conversation with somebody else. A lot of times those conversations might flow out of one another. And then when you start thinking about it, sort of you've got the meaning of these conversations proliferating from one person to the next. You've got this spread happening, and then after we're all gone, it keeps going. So I'm having conversations with my family today that are extensions of conversations by my parents, and conversations from my grandparents and their parents, all the way back. We are still having a conversation somebody started long ago. Which is why we can be truly plugged into what's happening in the gospel. So that's why I say it's new voices are continually added. This, I think, possibly reorients the way we see the gospel when we read it. If we sort of stop with this notion that Jesus is always pausing to utter some great truth, and everybody's just sitting there, hearing from him. And then see Jesus rather as somebody who is talking to people, listening to them when they talk, and seeing what they need as they speak to him. Part of what Jesus is doing is hearing them and speaking into their personal need. So he's not always just saying, here's this truth, here's that truth. He's like, what do you need? What do you need? And he's being this very personal, something new created for each person with whom he speaks. Which is, again, fascinating. It says personal as the healings he does for people. A conversation with them is as personal. When you go back and read the New Testament especially, and read the acts of Jesus and the things that he does with this kind of thing in mind, I think it really does change the way we see the gospel. It turns it into these moments, these holy moments, these moments of conversation with many people. And I go back and I'm always intrigued by this conversation between Jesus and the Canaanite woman in Matthew 15. And in the right one, for those of you who attend the 8 a.m. service, there's a quote from this in the prayer that we pray at the table, which is, Lord, we are not worthy so much as to take the crumbs from off every table. We pulled that from this passage. The Canaanite woman who comes to Jesus and says, please heal my daughter. And Jesus says, what seems to be kind of harsh. I'm sent to the children of Israel. In other words, I'm not here for you, lady, is what it sounds like. So it sounds really harsh. And she says in return, she doesn't take that as an answer. She says, yes. He says, I'm here, and they are the ones that will be fed. And then she says, yes, but even the dogs can take the crumbs from our table. Showing the level of humility that we should all be showing, right? And there are a lot of people out there. I have a different theory than some people on what's going on here. I think Jesus might have been using a rhetorical device, but there are a lot of people out there who basically say she changes his mind. Okay. That her act shifts him. And he meets her where she is. So it's fascinating, if that's the case, that she is part of this, what ultimately this new thing that is created. It's partly because of her and her response to him, and he listens. It's really a beautiful moment when you think about it. So we can take this then into Acts 2, and Acts 2 is the story of Pentecost. And, it has everybody there. You have one of these rare public events, okay, where the truth is being proclaimed to a large group of people. And unsurprisingly or surprisingly, everybody is hearing what is being said in their own language. And so communication barriers are taken down. And then one of the things that is said, that is promised, is that the disciples were at that time given new utterance. And I think this fits so well into the whole concept of dialogue, that new meaning is being created because of this understanding of divine presence in dialogue. So, this has been taken and interpreted a whole bunch of different ways, and I don't want to, overturn any of those. But possibly one thing that is definitely also happening is that new, fresh ways of seeing the world are emerging from the Holy Spirit being a welcome participant in the conversations and the dialogues that came from this. And then taking that one step further, you have Paul now, and the apostles go out, when what's called the diaspora, the scattering that takes place primarily because of persecution. They begin to get out of Jerusalem, they go to Antioch, and then you have people like Paul and Silas and Barnabas who go out around the Mediterranean. And there's a bit of a misperception that Paul spends all his time going and preaching, proclaiming the truth. And that's not what happens. When you read it carefully, he sets up a shop in a marketplace, and he sits at the booth. Hi, how are you doing? Are you interested in some canvas? Can I interest you in a piece of canvas? Oh, then he engages them in conversation. This is Paul's primary method of sharing truth, is talking to people in the marketplace. And he goes to the synagogues, but then you have all of these moments. You get the moment, where the kid falls out the window. And, but the subtext of that is they're upstairs in a room talking way into the night. Okay, so what you read through all of this is that Paul, like Jesus, spends a lot of time just talking to people and having conversations. And the amazing thing is that Christianity spreads over the first 3.5 centuries before there's actually a law and before it's actually ever legalized. It spreads throughout the Mediterranean without major, what we call the Sawdust Trail, tent revival meetings, all the things that, were part of the turn of the century. None of that was part of what took place. It was all dialogue. It was all conversations. It was all just gathering people into someone's house and having conversations. So I'm going to stop there and just ask, let's just talk for a little bit. Let's have a conversation. Let's talk about this idea. What do you think about this notion of conversations? Is this something that we should be getting back to? Maybe. Is there a place for this in our current conception of what it means to be a Christian and truth sharer? I'd love to hear your ideas.
Definitely, we need to get back to it. Conversation, as you said a minute ago, doesn't allow you an out. You're involved in it. You said you got the nasty email or comments in the email, but when you go personally to the person, and that's something we need more of in our society.
Okay, cool. Yeah, you can't. It's a little harder to walk away from a conversation, isn't it? You can't just hit delete.
Well, you've got a person there.
Yeah, exactly.
You've got a person there, and that's, if you have any respect for mankind, you're going to listen. You're going to try to listen. You're going to try to understand, or not necessarily, but it puts you in a position to at least make the effort.
So it requires investment.
Right.
A little heavier investment.
Exactly.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I have a friend who's an evangelist, and this reminded me of what he does. He goes to sporting events really all around the world and has a group of people that go with him, and they just go to outside the sporting events and basically engage people in conversations. Okay. They'll give them a track, but they'll just talk to them about Jesus and what he means to them, and sometimes it's effective and sometimes it's not. But, that's really good.
And I wonder, because I know this is when I was in college, they sent us out to do door-to-door evangelism, and it was not for me. Some folks really enjoyed it. I just never enjoyed it. One little bit. But it occurred to me years later, because a lot of them was the nature of the conversation was. I mean, here's a great way to start a conversation. If you died tonight, what would happen? Okay. Let's strike up a friendship, based on that. So, you can know, so we would kind of shock people with this type of question. And so part of what I wonder, along these lines of what you're talking about, in terms of the effectiveness, the one thing Paul does in the marketplace, there's an exchange, there's a relationship, even a tenuous relationship, gets established before, the shocker question, let me use what are those things called? The electrical pads, Yeah, exactly. Here's how we're going to get you into the kingdom. Clear. So for applying that type of thing, or rather than applying that type of thing, maybe the creation of a friendship, or at least a relationship, might precede. Now that requires a lot of work. Sometimes that's not what we terribly want to do, but and interesting thought there, yeah.
I think on a personal level, like kind of day to day, I think that we have to work to be more intentional to dialogue. There has to, like these, I think in times past before all the electronic communication and all that stuff, it just sort of naturally happened, these opportunities happen. I think now, such as the nature I am for myself in my life, that I have to actually, like, I plan like phone calls with friends or whatever, like we have to set it up, because if we don't have that intentionality, it just doesn't happen, because we're all going about our lives. And it's kind of isolating, you know, to kind of realize, oh, well, I haven't heard this person in a while, I should, you know, pick up the phone, you know. So it's nice to, like, with some friends who just have this planned kind of meeting, and that's really nice. But again, it just goes to the fact, I think, that we do have perhaps fewer opportunities for that day-to-day exchange, because we just live our lives differently these days.
And generationally, a lot of people don't know how to dialogue. I mean, there's a generation coming up who is being weaned on these things, and their parents. We go out to eat, and everybody's sitting around the table. You know, I mean, truly, how to listen, and God help them if they're watching a news program where you got talking heads and everyone's talking over each other, and not, I mean, the ability to listen and how to dialogue.
Yeah,
I heard a lecturer one time who said about dialogue between people, that the person that is talking with you needs to feel heard, whether you have a little feedback or whatever, but it's not satisfying if you don't feel like you're being heard.
Well, dialogue, I never thought of it quite like this, but dialogue requires a two-way personal investment in what's going on. And when I look at the way we communicate so much now today, email probably takes some effort, text, Lord, spell check takes over, and if you don't stop and look, you know, it goes to the world, and there's very little investment in that kind of communication if we're not careful. And I don't know, the people like you're talking about, it's almost like they're afraid to get involved in a dialogue. We're going to do it this way only. You know, I'm afraid to look you in the eye and talk to you.
Yeah.
You know, let's do it electronically at the speed of light. Whoa.
feel safer, right?
I guess.
I think too, when you talk about the emails, you know, what a person writes in an email and their thoughts are just in that email. That doesn't mean that you're going to read, you read email and you're going to read what you thought and that person thought at the time. You may take a whole lot different take on it, and they could be either negative or positive.
Especially if we don't read it as carefully as they wrote it. Which I'm guilty of. So, did you even read my email? I thought I did. Maybe I didn't.
The body language doesn't come through electronically, so this is
Yeah. And thinking back again about the gospel, you know, truth sharing. Truth sharing is not necessarily, if you see the way Christ did it, he doesn't always necessarily share what we would call a truth. Sometimes he just meets a need, you know, and so in some ways meeting a need is truth sharing. It's the truth that needs to be shared at that moment for that person. And we don't always, you know, sometimes we think we know what that person needs, but part of listening is also discerning what is needed at that moment. And I'm as guilty as the next person, thinking I need to get this idea across to them. You know, I need to get this. It's very important that they hear what I'm thinking. You know, maybe that's not what's as important. And dialogue will be a way, if we do it right, will be a way to be willing to show that opinion somewhere else and hear the person which when you stop to think about it is a really Christian idea, you know. But in terms of elevating the other person, helping them feel heard, you know, these things, that is a restorative, positive thing that it seems Christ-like, as opposed to the notion you've really got to know this particular truth, right? Maybe they can't hear that other thing unless first something else has been shared in that communal type of way.
The greatest gift I think you can give someone is to listen to them. That's a gift.
It is.
That's saying you're worthwhile, even if you don't disagree with them. Just to listen is a gift in itself.
Yeah, I've been thinking about how kind of our assumptions of certain things affects this. I teach art and culture, and one of the things we've been doing is going to a couple different churches, but having a discussion about how like architecture and that sort of thing affects our theology. One of the things we talk about is the transition from liturgical, focused on the table and the Eucharist, to, in the Protestant tradition, the pulpit's in the middle, preaching is elevated, we focus on the proclamation. And, you know, the churches I grew up in, there's always a lot of focus on that passage from Romans, and how can they hear without a preacher? Like, this idea that you can't even have the gospel unless there's a preacher. And you think about the story about the voice falling out of the window. That's the first time I ever heard of it. I ever heard it presented as a conversation into the night. I've always heard it as he was preaching into the night. And I'm just, thinking about, art historically, looking at these images of Christ and the disciples, it's almost always Christ standing up, preaching to the disciples, rather than sitting and having.
Our art feeds into that.
Yeah, and having this sort of conversation. And I was thinking about how that probably affects our church's interaction with the world, and how we are so busy proclaiming without listening, without interacting, without building a relationship. You don't have to have a relationship to proclaim.
Right.
It's easier not.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. And but just think about like our mindset. If our mindset as we're studying Scripture is proclamation first rather than dialogue first, it affects the way we interpret all of it and the way we apply all of it.
Exactly. Yes.
I was thinking back to the Martha Mary story. A thought I'd never had before is how did having Mary, a female, in that community, in that meeting, change?
Right.
And
Oh,
and I think often about when you have a unisex conversation versus anybody can chime in, and they go such different directions. And so, was it perfect that Mary was sitting there with the guys and bringing some feminine aspect into that conversation?
Right. That's what you get, kind of based on this, and then the way Paul was willing to set it up very radically. It doesn't get talked about as much as I kind of scream about it. Is that the early church, the first century church, the very beginning church, had men and women together. And it was the first time this was ever done. And we don't stop to think just how radical a thing that is in terms of how it does qualitatively and substantially change what's going on in those conversations. So, yeah. All right, folks, thanks so much. I think that'll do it for today. We'll come back next week and talk about another aspect of truth sharing.
Thank you.